The Chanson.De, Old French for "Song of Heroic Deeds," is a medieval narrative, a type of epic poem that appears at the dawn of French literature. The earliest known poems of this genre date from the late 11th and early 12th centuries, before the emergence of the lyric poetry of the trouvères and the earliest verse romances. They reached their apogee in the period 1150 to 1250, composed in verse. These narrative poems of moderate length were originally sung, or recited, by minstrels or jongleurs. More than 100 chansons de geste have survived in around 300 manuscripts that date from the 12th to the 15th century. Origins. Since the 19th century, much critical debate has centered on the origins of the chansons de geste, and particularly on explaining the length of time between the composition of the chansons and the actual historical events which they reference. The historical events the chansons allude to occur in the 8th through 10th centuries, yet the earliest chansons we have were probably composed at the end of the 11th century. Only 3 chansons de geste have a composition that incontestably dates from before 1150, the Chanson de Guillaume, the Song of Roland and Gourmand-et-Isambard. The first half of the Chanson de Guillaume may date from as early as the 11th century. Gourmand-et-Isambard may date from as early as 1068, according to one expert, and the Song of Roland probably dates from after 1086 to c. 1100. 3 early theories of the origin of chansons de geste believe in the continued existence of epic material in these intervening 2 or 3 centuries. Critics like Claude Charles Fouriel, François Reynaud, and German romanticists like Jacob Grimm posited the spontaneous creation of lyric poems by the people as a whole at the time of the historic battles, which were later put together to form the epics. This was the basis for the Cantilena theory of epic origin, which was elaborated by Gaston Paris, although he maintained that single authors, rather than the multitude, were responsible for the songs. This theory was also supported by Robert Fortier and by Elie Couteau-Gautier. At the end of the 19th century, Pio Rajner, seeing similarities between the chansons de geste and Old Germanic, Merovingian tales, posited a Germanic origin for the French poems. A different theory, introduced by the medievalist Paul Meyer, suggested the poems were based on old prose narrations of the original events. Another theory, developed by Joseph Bédier, posited that the early chansons were recent creations, not earlier than the year 1000, developed by singers who, emulating the songs of saints' lives sung in front of churches, created epic stories based on the heroes whose shrines and tombs dotted the great pilgrimage routes, as a way of drawing pilgrims to these churches. Critics have also suggested that knowledge by clerics of ancient Latin epics may have played a role in their composition. Subsequent criticism has vacillated between traditionalists and individualists, but more recent historical research has done much to fill in gaps in the literary record and complicate the question of origins. Critics have discovered manuscripts, texts, and other traces of the legendary heroes, and further explored the continued existence of a Latin literary tradition in the intervening centuries. The work of Jean Rigner on the art of the minstrels and the work of Parry and Lord on Yugoslavian oral traditional poetry, Homeric verse and oral composition have also been suggested to shed light on the oral composition of the chansons, although this view is not without its critics who maintained the importance of writing not only in the preservation of the texts, but also in their composition, especially for the more sophisticated poems. Subject matter and structure. Composed in Old French and apparently intended for oral performance by jongleurs, the chansons de geste narrate legendary incidents in the history of France during the 8th, 9th and 10th centuries, the age of Charles Martel. Charlemagne and Louis the Pious, with emphasis on their conflicts with the Moors and Saracens, and also disputes between kings and the vassals. The traditional subject matter of the Chansons de geste became known as the matter of France. This distinguished them from romances concerned with the matter of Britain, that is, King Arthur and his knights, and with the so-called matter of Rome, covering the Trojan War, the conquests of Alexander the Great, the life of Julius Caesar and some of his imperial successors, who were given medieval makeovers as exemplars of chivalry. A key theme of the Chansons de geste, which set them off from the romances, is the critique and celebration of community, collectivity and the representation of the complexities of feudal relations and service. The subject matter of the chansons evolved over time, according to public taste. Alongside the great battles and scenes of historic prowess of the early chansons, there began to appear other themes. Realistic elements and elements from the new court culture began to appear. Other fantasy and adventure elements derived from the romances were gradually added. Giants, magic, and monsters increasingly appear among the foes along with Muslims. There is also an increasing dose of Eastern adventure, drawing on contemporary experiences in the Crusades. In addition, one series of chansons retells the events of the First Crusade and the first years of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The conflicts of the 14th century brought a renewed epic spirit and nationalistic fervor to some chansons de geste. The poems contain an assortment of character types, the repertoire of valiant hero, brave traitor, shifty cowardly traitor, Saracen giant, beautiful Saracen princess, and so forth. As the genre matured, fantasy elements were introduced. Some of the characters that were devised by the poets in this manner include the fairy Oberon, who made his literary debut in Huon de Bordeaux, and the magic horse Baird, who first appears in Renaud de Montauban. Quite soon an element of self-parody appears. Even the august Charlemagne was not above gentle mockery in the Pèlerinage de Charlemagne. The narrative structure of the Chanson de geste has been compared to the one in the Nibelungenlied in Creole legends by Henry Whitman on the basis of common narime structure as first developed in the work of Eugene Dorfman and Jean-Pierre Tussaud. Versification. Early chansons de geste were typically composed in 10-syllable lines grouped in assonance stanzas. These stanzas are of variable length. An example from the Chanson de Roland illustrates the technique of the 10-syllable assonanced form. The assonance in this stanza is on E, D sus un pin, les un aiglante un fort desto diunt, fait out dormer, le siet li res qui dulce France dient. Blanchad le barbade floret le chef, gentad le cause et le continent fear, c'est qu'il demande, ni le resto et en sena. Under a pine tree, by a rosebush, there is a throne made entirely of gold. There sits the king who rules sweet France. His beard is white, with a full head of hair. He is noble in carriage, and proud of bearing. If anyone is looking for the king, he doesn't need to be pointed out. Later chansons were composed in monorhyme stanzas, in which the last syllable of each line rhymes fully throughout the stanza. Later chansons also tended to be composed using Alexandrines lines, instead of 10-syllable lines. The following example of the 12-syllable rhymed form is from the opening lines of Les Chequtifs, a chanson in the Crusade cycle. The rhyme is on I, or Saint Fuit Corbarans tos les plaines de Chourie, Nuren main K, E, wa en essence compagnie. So in Port Broharders, fils Soudan de Percy, en la histoire la voix morte le respect forbi, les bons dus Godefroy le chier hardy tres devant anthosi en la prairie. Sir Corbaran escaped across the plains of Syria. He took only 2 kings in his company. He carried away Brohadus, son of the Sultan of Persia, who had been killed in the battle by the clean sword of the brave-spirited good Duke Godfrey right in front of Antioch, down in the meadow. These forms of versification were substantially different than the forms found in the Old French verse romances, which were written in octosyllabic, rhymed couplets, composition and performance. The public of the Chansons.De, the late public of the 11th to the 13th centuries, was largely illiterate, except for members of the great courts and smaller noble families. Thus, the chansons were primarily an oral medium. Opinions vary greatly on whether the early chansons were first written down and then read from manuscripts or memorized for performance, or whether portions were improvised, or whether they were entirely the product of spontaneous oral composition and later written down. Similarly, scholars differ greatly on the social condition and literacy of the poets themselves. Were they cultured clerics or illiterate jongleurs working within an oral tradition, as an indication of the role played by orality in the tradition of the chanson-de-geste, lines and sometimes whole stanzas, especially in the earlier examples, noticeably formulaic in nature, making it possible both for the poet to construct a poem in performance and for the audience to grasp a new theme with these. Scholarly opinions differ on the exact manner of recitation, but it is generally believed that the chansons-de-geste were originally sung by poets, minstrels or jongleurs, who would sometimes accompany themselves, or be accompanied, on the vielle, a medieval fiddle played with a bow. Several manuscript texts include lines in which the jongleur demands attention, threatens to stop singing, promises to continue to the next day, and asks for money or gifts. By the middle of the 13th century, singing had probably given way to recitation. It has been calculated that a reciter could sing about 1,000 verses an hour and probably limited himself to 1,000 to 1,300 verses by performance, making it likely that the performance of works extended over several days, given that many chansons from the late 12th century on extended to over 10,000 verses or more. It is conceivable that few spectators heard the longest works in their entirety, while poems like the Song of Roland were sometimes heard in public squares and were no doubt warmly received by a broad public. Some critics caution that the chansons should probably not be characterized as popular literature, and some chansons appear particularly tailored for an audience of aristocratic, privileged warrior classes. The poems themselves, more than 100 chansons-de-geste have survived in around 300 manuscripts that date from the 12th to the 15th century. Several popular chansons were written down more than once in varying forms. The earliest chansons are all anonymous. Many later ones have named authors. By the middle of the 12th century, the corpus of works was being expanded principally by cyclization, that is to say by the formation of cycles of chansons attached to a character or group of characters, with new chansons being added to the ensemble by singing of the earlier or later adventures of the hero, of the youthful exploits, the great deeds of their ancestors or descendants, or the retreat from the world to a convent, or attached to an event. About 1215, Bertrand de Bar-sur-Aube, in the introductory lines to his Jurat-de-Vienne, subdivided the matter of France, the usual subject area of the chansons-de-geste, into 3 cycles, which revolved around 3 main characters. There are several other less formal lists of chansons, or of the legends they incorporate. One can be found in the Fabliaux, entitled Des de Bordeaux Rebaus, a humorous tale of the second half of the 13th century, in which a jongleur lists the stories he knows. Another is included by the Catalan troubadour Guiraut de Cabrera in his humorous poem On Son Hamin. better known from its first words as cabaret juggler. This is addressed to a juggler and purports to instruct him on the poems he ought to know but doesn't. The listing below is arranged according to Bertrand de Bar-sur-Aub's cycles, extended with 2 additional groupings and with a final list of chansons that fit into no cycle. There are numerous differences of opinion about the categorization of individual chansons. Geste. The chief character is usually Charlemagne, one of his immediate successors. A pervasive theme is the king's role as champion of Christianity. This cycle contains the first of the chansons to be written down, the Chanson de Roland or Song of Roland. Chanson de Roland. Several other versions exist, including the Occitan romances, the Middle High German Rolandslied, and the Latin Carmen de Protatione Ganonis. Pèlerinage de Charlemagne, Voyage de Charlemagne à Jerusalem à Constantinople, dealing with a fictional expedition by Charlemagne and his knights. Fiérabres. Aspremont. A later version formed the basis of Aspromonte by Andrea da Barberino. Ancaeus de Carthage. Chanson de Censor, Song of the Saxons by Jean Bodel. Huon de Bordeaux, originally c. 1215 to 1240, known from slightly later manuscripts. A prequel and 4 sequels were later added. Oberon, Chanson des Clermont Clarice Florent Ydea Olive Gaudin. Johann de Lanson. Berthe Grand Pied by Adonette Loire, and a later Franco-Italian reworking. Les Enfances Aiguilles by Adonette Loire, Tuoguia the Dane. Intrae d'Espagne. Hugues Capet. Galen's Lee Restore, known from a single manuscript of about 1490. Iquin or Aquin. Otil or Otinal. Mainet. Basin. Aiguille le Danois by Raimbert de Paris. Gouy de Bourgogne. Macaire la Chanson de la Reine Sebille. Huon de Verne. A lost chanson known from a 16th-century retelling. The hero is mentioned among epic heroes in the Anson Hamin of Guiraut de Cabrera, and figures as a character in Mainet. Geste de Garin de Montglain. The central character is not Garin de Montglain but his supposed great-grandson, Guillaume de Range. These chansons deal with knights who were typically younger sons, not heirs, who seek land and glory through combat with the infidel enemy. Chanson de Guillaume. Couronnement de Louis. Le Charrois de Nîmes. Le Prise deranged reworking of a lost version from before 1122. Alascans, with several later versions. Le Bataille Le Coiffeur by Grain d'Or de Brie. Le Moniage Renouart by Grain d'Or de Brie. Falques de Candy by Herbert le Duc of Damartin. Simon de Pouille or Simon of Apulia. Fictional Eastern adventures. The hero is said to be a grandson of Garin de Montglain. Flauvent. The hero is a son of Merovingian King Clovis I Mary de Narbonne by Bertrand de Bar-sur-Aube. Jurat de Vienne by Bertrand de Bar-sur-Aube, also found in a later shorter version alongside Henort de Buland and Rainier de Gênes. Les Enfances Garin de Montglain. Garin de Montglain. Henort de Buland, a fragment of the 14th century and a later version. Rainier de Gênes. Les Enfances Guillaume. Les Narbonnais, in 2 parts, known as Le Département des Enfants Imeri. Le Siege de Narbonne. Les Enfances Vivian. Le Covenant Vivian à la Chevalerie Vivian. Le Siege de Barbaste. Beauvon de Camarcus. Reworking by Adonette Loire of the Siege de Barbaste. Guibert d'Andrines. Le Prise de Cordes. Le Mort Mary de Narbonne. Les Enfances Rainier. Le Moniage Guillaume. Geste de Dune de Mayence. This cycle concerns traitors and rebels against royal authority. In each case the revolt ends with the defeat of the rebels and their eventual repentance. Gourmand et Sambat. Jurat de Roussillon. The hero Jurat de Roussillon also figures in Jurat de Vienne, in which he is identified as a son of Garin de Montglain. There is a later sequel, Aubry le Bourgoing, Renaud de Montalban les Quatre Fils Simon, Raoul de Cambrai, apparently begun by Berthollet, existing version from end of 12th century. Dune de Mayence, Dune de Nanteuil, current in the second half of the 12th century, now known only in fragments which derive from a 13th century version. To this several sequels were attached. d'Avignon, probably composed between 1195 and 1205. The fictional heroine is first married to Garnier de Nanteuil, who is son of Dune de Nanteuil and grandson of Dune de Mayence. After Garnier's death she marries the Saracen Ganna, Guy de Nanteuil, evidently popular around 1207 when the troubadour Raimbeau de Vaqueras mentions the story. The fictional hero is son of the heroine of d'Avignon, Tristan de Nanteuil. The fictional hero is son of the hero of Guy de Nanteuil, Paris la Duchesse. The fictional heroine is daughter of the heroine of d'Avignon. Exiled from France, she gives birth to a son, Hugues, who becomes king of Hungary. Malgus de Aigrement, Vivian la Machaua de Montbrang, Lorraine cycle. This local cycle of epics of Lorraine traditional history, in the late form in which it is now known, includes details evidently drawn from Huon de Bordeaux and Auguille le Danois, Guerin le Lorraine, Hervis de Metz, Gerber de Metz, Anses Fils de Gerber. Crusade cycle not listed by Bertrand de Bar-sur-Aube. This cycle deals with the First Crusade and its immediate aftermath. Chanson d'Antioche, apparently begun by Richard Le Pelerin c. 1100, earliest surviving text by Graindor-d'Orbay c. 1180, expanded version 14th century, Les Chequetifs Sterling. The adventures of the poor crusaders led by Peter the Hermit. The hero is Harpenter Bourges. The episode was eventually incorporated, c. 1180, by Graindor-d'Orbay in his reworking of the Chanson d'Antioche. Matabron tells the story of old Matabron and of the great-grandfather of Godefroy de Bouillon. Le Chevalier Océan tells the story of Elias, grandfather of Godefroy de Bouillon. Originally composed around 1192, it was afterwards extended and divided into several branches. Les Enfances Godefroy, or Childhood Exploits of Godefroy, tells the story of the youth of Godefroy de Bouillon and his three brothers. Chanson de Jerusalem, Le Mort de Godefroy de Bouillon, quite unhistorical, narrates Godefroy's poisoning by the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Baudouin de Saborch, Bâtard de Bouillon. Others, Gourmanteus and Bart, Amy Emile, followed by a sequel, Jourdain de Blay, Boeuf de Hanston, and a related poem, D'Orelle Beton, whose putative Old French version is lost. The story is known from an Occitan version of c. 1200, Iga et Morin. Aimala Chequetif, a lost chanson. Aiol. Tessaias de Cologne, possibly a romance. The chansons de geste reached their apogee in the period 1150 to 1250. By the middle of the 13th century, public taste in France had begun to abandon these epics, preferring, rather, the romances. As the genre progressed in the middle of the 13th century, only certain traits remained to set the chansons apart from the romances. The 15th century saw the cycles of chansons converted into large prose compilations. Yet the themes of the epics continued to exert an influence through the 16th century. Legacy and adaptations. The chansons de geste created a body of mythology that lived on well after they ceased to be produced in France. The French chanson gave rise to the old Spanish tradition of the cantar de geste. The Chanson, geste was also adapted in southern France. One of the three surviving manuscripts of the Chanson de Roussillon is in Occitan, as are two works based on the story of Charlemagne and Roland of Saragossa and Roncesvalles. The Chanson de geste form was also used in such Occitan texts as Canzo d'Antioche, Orality, and Song of the Albigensian Crusade. In medieval Germany, the chansons de geste elicited little interest from the German courtly audience, unlike the romances, which were much appreciated. While the Song of Roland was among the first French epics to be translated into German, and the German poet Wolfram von Eschenbach based his 13th-century epic Wilhelm on the Alaskans, a work in the cycle of William of Orange, these remained isolated examples, other than a few other works translated from the cycle of Charlemagne in the 13th century. The chansons de geste were not adapted into German, and it is believed that this was because the epic poems lacked what the romances specialized in portraying: scenes of idealized knighthood, love and courtly society. In the late 13th century, certain French chansons de geste were adapted into the Old Norse Carla Magnus saga. In Italy, there exist several 14th-century texts in verse prose which recount the feats of Charlemagne in Spain, including a chanson de geste in Franco-Venetian, the Entrée d'Espagne, and a similar Italian epic La Spagna in Ottava Rima. Through such works, the matter of France became an important source of material in Italian romantic epics. Morgante by Luigi Pulci, Orlando in Inamorato by Matteo Maria Boardo, Orlando Furioso by Ludovico Ariosto, and Jerusalem Delivered by Torquato Tasso are all indebted to the French narrative material. The incidents and plot devices of the Italian epics later became central to works of English literature such as Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene. Spenser attempted to adapt the form devised to tell the tale of the triumph of Christianity over Islam to tell instead of the triumph of Protestantism over Roman Catholicism.